Okay, good morning. Shall we start again? We're about 2 minutes late. We've got 1 hour, and the first 40 minutes will be a presentation, and the last 20 minutes will be a discussion. It's my great pleasure to introduce Carol Benson. We've known each other, known each other since the Tashkent conference, which was a long time ago.
Which year?
I can't remember either. Jeff, do you remember? 2003, right. Carol did a presentation there, and I happened to edit the proceedings, so we were in correspondence for some time over that. And a couple of years ago, I met Carol at a conference in UNESCO, and she remembered me and said, "You're very precise," or something like that in your editing. Yeah.
It's a good characteristic.
I was asking Carol for some human interest stories that she could share with us for her extensive travels in many continents over many years. And she said one striking event that she experienced was traveling by plane from Johannesburg to Antananarivo. And apparently you tell the story.
Oh gosh, all right, I can tell it. First, Howell was looking for something interesting to say about me, and I couldn't think of anything. So apologies for that. But he reminded me that there was a time when I was flying to Madagascar for the first time to look at language issues in education, but I had the misfortune of being on the same plane as the former president who had decided to return to Madagascar. And so just before landing, we were turned away from the airport and also from the airports of Maputo and I'm trying to remember where else, in Mauritius. And so we had to return to Johannesburg because the country wasn't ready for their former president to return. So it was sort of bad timing on the flight. Anyway.
Okay, so let's welcome Carol, and her topic is empowering non-dominant languages and cultures through multilingual curriculum development.
I'm going to try to time myself also. The subheading of the title I'd like to just mention to you because it's also the subheading of a paper that I've recently written with Itziar Elorza from the Basque country in Spain. And we've been sort of looking at what can you do with multilingual curriculum development. And so we're proposing multilingualism for all. So a bit like education for all, now we're trying to sort of promote MEFA, multilingual education for all. If it catches on, great. So I'll try to just tell you a little bit about myself so you know where I'm coming from when I'm talking about multilingual development, having come from a country that perceives itself as being very monolingual, but it isn't. Some concepts and terms that we've been working with, and some that some of us are proposing as new terms or ways to help us talk about multilingual contexts. Going to call for a new paradigm, which many people have been calling for at this conference. The idea of creating a multilingual habitus or a multilingual ideology or way of thinking about the world, and give you a little bit of inspiration at the end. So my first contact with the mismatch between school language and learners' own languages was in Sierra Leone. I was a Peace Corps volunteer some years ago, and I was supposed to be training primary school teachers who didn't have formal training as teachers. And what ended up happening was that they really needed basic English and maths because English was the medium of instruction in Sierra Leone. And of course, none of the learners spoke English. So it was that paradox that we've been talking about at this conference and previously. So what happens in that gap? So this led me to a very crazy career as a practitioner, a teacher trainer, and also an academic, trying to write about and research about these issues, and also working as a technical assistant, often with ministries of education in different countries that were trying to start implementing some kind of L1-based programs, multilingual or bilingual programs. So I kind of have this crazy profile of being a practitioner, being a technical assistant, and also being an academic, trying to stay in, continue publishing and researching in this area. I think many of you at this conference are trying to do similar things. I won't spend too much time on this because I think we all recognize the context. But the crazy thing, I think, is that organizations like UNESCO have been talking about language issues since the 1950s, that it's axiomatic that we use languages that learners understand, and yet we are still in this situation of trying to support multilingual education. Latin America has this tradition, missionary tradition, also the idea of liberation theology in Latin America, where local languages were used, have been used, and now they have, many countries have what's called EIB, Educación Intercultural Bilingüe, bilingual intercultural education. So they actually have built in the multicultural or intercultural element into their bilingual models, but they're still talking about early exit. And then there were nationalist policies. I'm thinking of a lot of African countries where at independence they didn't necessarily embrace the post-colonial language. In Guinea, Sékou Touré, the first president of the country, introduced 7 national languages in education. Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, education for self-reliance, the use of Kiswahili. The Philippines is another example where Tagalog, one lingua franca, was proposed for use, and Madagascar, Malagasy. So we have these examples of countries not necessarily fully embracing the ex-colonial language, but yet there was still this focus on one language for unity, even if it wasn't always the exogenous language, the European language. See if we can get this. And then, of course, we have the powerful sort of dominant languages, not only European, not only English. And I've heard many of you saying that we're not just talking about English in a lot of situations. The idea of development as modernization and these languages as representing some aspiration. Even the concept of mass education or the idea that one teacher works with a classroom of students, it's a Western concept. Even the West didn't have mass education, so we're all learning from this. We've got the myth of the monolingual nation state. I think that myth probably has been traced back to France's efforts to use French as a way to pull the French-speaking world together. And then we have symptoms of that still today, which is, for example, the reporting of literacy rates without even mentioning what language we're talking about. You see that over and over. UNESCO people, note, please. And we've been characterizing this as a language as problem orientation. It's been going on for a long time. So I think we need to think about how to change the paradigm. This kind of overarching ideology has been called a monolingual habitus, or monolingual ideology, and this is a term developed by Ingrid Gogolin in Europe, because she was actually criticizing bilingual programs, saying they still come from a monolingual mindset, and she was using the idea of Bourdieu as habitus, a set of dispositions or assumptions that you have in your mind. Another example of habitus would be, for example, if you're telling your friend, oh, I went to the doctor today, and your friend says, what did he say? That's an example of an assumption, right? People just say, okay, the doctor must be a guy. Don't even think about it. Hopefully that's changing too. But anyway, so she was criticizing the ways that people talk even about bilingual education in Europe. And then we have people like Goke Pariola, who as far back as '93 was applying these ideas to what happens in Nigeria and the power of international languages. And then people like Robert Phillipson and Steve Clayton actually did a really nice article on the engineering of the international language in Cambodia. The changing of the international language from French to English. And I really recommend that article to look at the intent. A lot of this, what's happening in dominant languages, is not innocent. It's not Darwinism. It's actually being engineered by certain organizations or, I won't say more. Think about it. So some of us have been working with definitions. Tove Skutnab-Kangas, quite a long time ago, tried to define mother tongue in a few ways. And she suggested, so if you take away the orange additions, which are mine, she offered 4 different definitions for mother tongue. One was that it was the language that one learns first. Another is that we identify with that language. It might be a language that we know best, or it might be a language that we use most. But not all of these apply to all of our mother tongues, right? So she was trying to get the range, capture the range of definitions that we could have for mother tongue, or L1. And so a lot of us still find this a little bit problematic because we know that people in multilingual contexts have more than one L1, right? So we're talking about L1s. And then we haven't been talking very much about culture and how your own cultural beliefs and practices and traditions kind of come into that. Not just talking about dancing or painting. We're talking about your ways of thinking and knowing. So trying to bring those in. And then with my colleague Kimmo Kosonen, who's been working a lot in Southeast Asia, also with multilingual education issues, we tried to add an additional definition that it might not be all of those other definitions, but it's a language that somebody speaks and understands well enough to learn through. So we're trying to broaden the definition even more, even though we're still using the terms mother tongue and L1. So if somebody can come up with a new L, that would be helpful. Kimmo and I have also proposed that we use these terms for talking about languages, because L1 and L2, especially L2, has a lot of difficulties, right? L2 is not necessarily heard in your environment. And is it really the L2, and is the sequence there, and is it important? So we wanted to bring in the idea of power by talking about dominant language and non-dominant languages. So the advantages to using these terms, in our opinion, is that we avoid a reference to size. We've heard people talk about big languages and small languages, but is that really the issue? Because we need to use learners' languages in schools. Whether their language is a little language or a big language, it's important to their learning. So we're trying to avoid that, the term minority or majority, and we're trying to highlight the fact that this is a power relationship. And also to show the arbitrariness, because a language that, for example, Khmer is the national language in Cambodia, so you would say it's a dominant language. In Vietnam, it's a non-dominant language. So we're not talking necessarily about how many people speak it, but what status it has in society. There are a couple problems with these terms. You can probably think of some of them, and we can definitely talk about them afterwards. But having this dichotomy, it may miss the nuances between languages. So we recognize that it's sort of limiting to call something a dominant language or a non-dominant language. And we're also hoping for change. So we don't want to just label languages and say, okay, that's a non-dominant language, and it will be forever. Because we hope that as languages are brought into education and other domains, they will actually gain power. Then I wanted to bring, I think there's been an effort here to talk about multilingualism, and I wanted to bring to you maybe some new directions in thinking about what multilingualism actually means. We've been working on, I think some of you may recognize the name Bialystok, Ellen Bialystok, who's worked a lot with, she's a psycholinguist. She does all these really interesting experiments with people's brains and with testing people on their languages. And so she's found that transfer is multidirectional. So obviously, many of you know this already. You might have learned in a language that was not your home language. You may have learned to read and write, but you can transfer those skills back to your own language. You can even transliterate your own language. If you don't know the script that's used for that language, you can use another script to try to write your language. So there's a lot of things. That's just one example. We know that transfer is multidirectional in human brains. And it so doesn't necessarily go from L1 to L2 to L3, and especially not in multilingual societies. Then there's some very interesting work being done, also based in Europe, so I'd like to bring it to multilingual contexts outside Europe. But there's something called dynamic systems theory, and some people like Ulrike Jesner in Germany is working on research in this area. It's the being able to manage more than two languages. It's not just an overlap of these languages or these subsystems, as she calls them. Oops. Okay. That's new. There we go. She says that being multilingual actually changes your whole system, your whole brain and ways of thinking. And Bialystok has also found, I just had an opportunity to hear her speak in the spring in New York, and they have imaging of the brain that shows how different a multilingual person's brain is as compared to a monolingual. Multilinguals, probably most of us in this room, are using more of our brains, and we're also able to do a lot of tasks that monolinguals cannot do. So the result is that you have a new set of skills. It's not just language 1 plus language 2 plus language 3. So there's some kind of synergy. We already knew that there's some kind of synergy between languages. Now when we're talking about more than two languages, we're talking about a new brain, a new condition. And this is an area of research that's just starting, but I find it very exciting, and I think we should be redefining the field from the multilingual's points of view. So one of my questions for myself, and it's sort of a challenge to all of us, is to think of what a multilingual habitus in educational development would look like. So if we're critiquing the ideology of monolingual thinking, what do we do? So first of all, I think a lot of us have talked about this. We need to have a language as resource orientation. We need to see the whole language repertoire as a resource in the classroom and in ourselves. And we need to think about the terms, question the power relations between languages, and really question people when they speak with a monolingual habitus. You can hear that in their thinking. So the question, at least traditionally, has been, what happens when learners don't speak the language of the school? Language of the school, right? That's the either-or thing. And then obviously the aim inherent in that question is that we want children to be monolingual in the dominant language. We don't really care about how they get there. This drawing is by Dennis Malone of SIL International, and he was just trying to portray that sink or swim approach and how using the mother tongue helps children kind of get to the school. But I wanted to draw attention to the way that question is asked, and I feel that the question should be asked like this. How can the school build on the linguistic resources of the learners? It should be learner-based education, right? We should be thinking about what the learners bring with them to the classrooms, making those connections, as Vygotsky or any other educational psychologist would recommend, and then building on those. So the aim should be not monolingualism in the dominant language, but multilingualism and multiliteracies, right? Being able to read and write all of your languages, but perhaps at different levels depending on what your needs are. And also we need to think about whether a first grader needs to be literate in 3 languages yet. So we're taking some inspiration from the integrated language curriculum that's been developed in the Basque autonomous community in Spain. It's also been adopted by schools that are Catalan speaking in Spain. So this comes from Spain, and it comes from linguistic communities who are trying to promote their own languages in a coherent program that prepares learners for a modern life. A modern multilingual life. So see what you think about this, if you haven't heard about it before. They're proposing the systematic teaching of 3 or 4 languages in their entire school system, beginning from the first day of school. Not necessarily bringing in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds to learn yet, but whenever they start school, so formal schooling, probably first grade. So they're using Basque, their own language, their community language. It's a non-dominant language, so that's the NDL there. But it's many people's L1 or C1. That is, they identify as Basque. Maybe their families have been losing the language, so they're bringing it back. So that's another aspect that I won't talk about today, but I find very interesting. So they have Basque. They have Spanish, which is the dominant language of their country, and they're bringing in English and French into their school system, which makes sense given the linguistic landscape of their surroundings. The NDL, Basque, is the main language of teaching and learning. They're trying to revitalize it amongst the learners that don't speak it well, and also use it amongst the learners who do speak it well. Then they've developed a list of common general competencies that can be learned in any language, right? That's the curriculum part of it. What do learners need to learn about languages in general, and also about the other subjects? And then they develop language-specific aims based on the language. So let's say in French, these are the competencies that children should learn at grade 1, grade 2, and so on. And then they're also deciding which methods are appropriate to use for which languages, and also how to test in those languages. So for example, they may look at mathematics, a review section in mathematics, and they may say, okay, the children have learned this concept, let's say multiplication, they've learned it in Basque. So how about if we do the review in French? And then maybe we'll test in both languages and see how much they've learned about the content. So they're not testing language when they're talking about content. They're testing the content, but they're using different languages to deliver or practice that content. So they have very specific competencies, and they decide which languages are used when and how. So obviously this requires some trained teachers and some very creative people. But they also don't expect every teacher to be quadrilingual. So they're also working with how can teachers partner in the classroom to deliver content and language instruction in these different languages. And when we talk about appropriate assessment, we're also talking about different levels of expectation for the different languages. So for example, you would probably expect fairly high levels of performance after the first couple of years of school in Basque, but not necessarily in French. Those would be very basic competencies that they're learning. So if we're thinking about how to apply multilingual education, I think we need to rethink a lot of aspects of teaching and learning. One is that when we're working in curriculum development, we need to plan for realistic aims in each language. We cannot plan for fluency in a language that teachers don't speak. Children cannot possibly acquire new languages if their teachers don't speak them. And for teaching and learning, this has implications for, as I was just saying, who teaches which languages, how do they do it? Are they taught as languages, as foreign languages, or as familiar languages? Are they taught through content, such as math or science or social studies? And are languages and content taught bilingually or multilingually? Are languages allowed in the classroom? Can learners express themselves in whatever language their ideas arrive in their heads? We also need to rethink teacher training and placement based on the linguistic and cultural proficiencies of the teachers. We need to build on their linguistic and cultural resources, and we need to place them appropriately. So if their proficiency is in Basque, let's say, we need to put them in a Basque-speaking school. That's a European example, but you know what I mean. And then with assessment, my colleagues in South Africa have been experimenting for some time with testing in more than one language, and they got some interesting results. The Praisa unit at the University of Cape Town tested in isiXhosa and English, and found that when they had a sort of side-by-side bilingual test, it was in science, I believe, that children answered some of the questions in one language, some of the questions in the other, but they were more able to express their ideas and do well on the test. So those are the kinds of models that we need to use. I also heard about another model yesterday of bilingual textbooks. And we've also experimented with those in Vietnam in a bilingual project. The idea that you should give teachers and parents and learners all the possible resources they will need in textbook. It may not be exact translations of each other, but teaching the content in a couple of languages with glossaries in the back, as that example mentioned, to give learners options. And their parents perhaps can help them, depending on which languages are there. So assessment and materials as well. And then thinking about what's the target. What's our target group? What are our aims? Our aims are not necessarily to make people monolingual in a dominant language. Our aims should be, hopefully will be in the future, multilingualism. And not just for speakers of non-dominant languages, but everyone in the country or in the school system. I've also been trying to think of how to practice what I preach. How do you practice multilingualism? How do you have that habitus and use it in your own work? So it's not so easy for academics either, right? You're trying to publish your results. You want to publish them in appropriate fora. Perhaps you're writing in a different way or in a different genre if you want to publish locally, and also in a different language. If you want people in Madagascar to understand the importance of Malagasy in education, okay, so your publishing needs to be in those languages. And I think we have to challenge also the publishing world, which tends to focus on just a couple of dominant languages. One thing I heard when I was working in Mexico, my colleagues were complaining that whenever they wrote something about local languages in Mexico, they had to publish not in Spanish, but in English to be published in recognized journals. So it's really a shame when a good part of the world, all the Americas are Spanish speaking, and yet academics feel that they have to publish in another language. I think we have to, promoting policies and letting people know about policies to maximize learners' linguistic resources, and maybe redefining the field from the point of view of multilingual people. Many of you are in this room, your own thinking about how you use languages and what levels of different languages you need in your life. Those are the kinds of things that are not in the academic literature very much yet. And so I think we have to open up that academic literature to more multilingual voices. And then there's the challenge of publishing or co-publishing multilingually. I'll just give you one example, and it's not really a good example, but it's the example I have. Kimmo Kosonen and I edited a volume a couple of years ago of papers from the Comparative and International Education Society that had to do with using non-dominant languages. And this is just a picture of the cover. We worked with Sense Publishers, who are a small publishing company that does a lot in international education, and I must say they didn't do a lot for us. So we did a lot of the actual formatting of the papers and so on. We did all the copy editing, etc. So it was a do-it-yourself project. But the good thing about that is that we could actually ask for a couple of things that we wanted in this book. One thing, I don't know if Birgit's here, but Birgit Brock-Utne, who's one of the contributors to this volume, raised our awareness about how when you're referencing people, if you don't use their first names, if you just use initials, then no one can see that women are also publishing academic literature. We can't always tell anyway, you can't always tell from someone's name, but anyway, it was one aspect of gender that we were able to fight for and get. So people's whole names are in all of the references in this edited volume. So that was one thing. And then another thing is somehow we wanted to be able to publish in non-dominant languages. We couldn't really publish these chapters in languages other than English, but here's what we did. It's symbolic, but it's there. So this is an example of the first chapter. It was written by Jessica Ball, who's also a proponent of multilingual education, a specialist in pre-primary education, with her colleague who is a speaker of Cree. They're based at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. We had a wide range of contributors to this book. But anyway, so what we decided to do with each chapter is we asked the authors to find a way to translate their abstract into a non-dominant language. Perhaps it was the language that they were talking about in the article, or a language that they had some contact with. And so in this case, their abstract comes first in the non-dominant language they chose, which was Northern Cree. What does this do? I guess we could say it's symbolic, but we put the non-dominant languages first in the abstracts. And one of the aspects of feedback that we've gotten about this book is people were grateful to see their languages and other non-dominant languages in print, because it shows people that these languages exist, they are used, they are read, and they are written. So that's what we did in that book. It's a small step, symbolic, but it's there, and it promotes our ideas of multilingualism. So it's just one idea, and I'm sure you'll have some others, but I'm hoping that this will encourage everyone to fight for what you believe in, and not just agree to some kind of publishing standards, and come up with some creative ideas of how to expose people to non-dominant languages. So I want to end with some words of inspiration from Professor Neville Alexander, who we lost a few years ago. A very important figure in South African language policy and many other aspects of South African life. But one of my favorite things that he would tell us as we were working in multilingual education, he would say, if you're not carrying out your own agenda, you're carrying out someone else's. And I think that if we do not want to be carrying out the agenda of global dominant languages, then we need to practice what we preach as much as possible and carry out our own agendas. So I'll leave you with those words, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is absolutely fascinating and raises all sorts of issues. You've asked a central question: what would a multilingual habitus in education and development look like? And you've told us about the Basque and Catalan experiment, which in themselves have raised all sorts of issues. And then you've brought the issue back to us as practitioners. How can we become more multilingual in our own work. Really fascinating, and we've got just over 20 minutes to explore these issues. I can't see you very well. Yeah. Any hands up? Yes, Giri.
Thank you. Thank you for a very good talk. I just wanted to report that in our university in Bengaluru, in South India, in Azim Premji University, we've been consciously trying out various strategies in our classrooms to make them multilingual and multivocal, because we've recruited, we've taken students consciously from very, very diverse backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds and linguistic abilities. An exercise, for example, last semester that I did with my students was to discuss proverbs in various languages, ask them to bring proverbs from their own languages, translate those proverbs into English as well as they could, and talk about what is learnt and how these function, the various features of proverbs in their own languages. It was a very, of course, very interactive and exciting exercise, but it was also very useful for them to see just how much linguistic knowledge they already come to the classroom with. And these are master's students. I'm not talking about school children. Some of them later finished the course and tried that out in their own schools, and they reported enormous success. So yes, I think a variety of classroom strategies are possible and should be tried out. And I just wanted to add that our Right to Education Act 2009 in India mandates that children are not to be held back, but they need to be tested. So on the one hand, teachers often complain about having to put the child into the next class whether or not she is ready. But on the other hand, it also frees up for the teacher the possibility of designing her own assessment strategies, which are not then answerable to, which are not mandated by a school administration. So there is a possibility also that opens up with this 2009 Act. Thank you.
Only to say that thank you for those strategies, and it sounds like you have quite a few others since you do have that diverse group of students. So maybe our next book, a few of us should be working on promoting those kinds of, or discussing those kinds of strategies and making that available to others. You don't have to use me. Yeah, your next book.
Yes, my name is Sanjoy Day.
Wait a minute, the gentleman at the front here, and then you.
Thank you. My name is Lakshman Gimire. I'm from Nepal. Do you think, ma'am, all these good efforts that you discuss would be useful and would bring the expected result without reformation in the existing socio-political and socio-economic structure of the society? Because people do not choose languages by their own will. They are forced to choose languages within the socio-cultural, socio-economic, and socio-political habitus. Thank you.
Just going to stand up because I can't see everyone over there. Thank you for that, and I know that it's a source of frustration to many of us that society doesn't always, maybe there's even enabling legislation or policy, but then when it comes to resourcing good programs or giving resources to the recognition of non-dominant languages, there's something missing, or everything is missing. And so some of us are frustrated, and we fight very hard for the rights of children to learn, or adults to learn in their own languages, and then we're frustrated by the larger political, social, economic structures. One of the things that I learned from Neville Alexander and colleagues in Cape Town is that you can't wait around for others to make it possible for you to do things. You just have to kind of step forward and maybe try to work within those structures to change them. If you can't work within, perhaps you have to work from without and develop some kind of showcases or demonstrating what could be done. And then also there's always publishing at different levels, perhaps in newspapers, opinion pieces, looking for different fora where you can describe what your vision is for education. So I know that it's very hard and very challenging, and I think that's why Neville's words are very meaningful to me and hopefully to many of you. It's just that you have to keep trying because it's your agenda and it's not someone else's agenda.
Yeah, my name is Sanjoy Day. I have realized that in India now, English is becoming a non-dominant language, I have a feeling. Because I wrote the book 40 years ago and I have not been able to publish it.
No.
And the name of the book is Gospel Truth. And if you translate it into Indian language, it is Amrit Vani. It's all about British culture, English poets and writers and all that. So I've come to the conclusion at the fag end of my life that struggling writers should fall in love with publishers' daughters in order to be successful in life.
Or sons. Or as you could probably sympathize, working with publishers like this who basically don't do very much. So we did everything on our own. It was a lot of work just technically to get the chapters in form, but it allowed us to do some things that we might not otherwise have been able to do. So marriage is not the only possibility.
Yes, Kirk Person from SIL, and I think a few years ago I brought some MLE teachers from Thailand to Basque country, and they were so encouraged to see it. And a couple things stood out to me. One was that when they started their bilingual education program 25 years ago, the parents had a choice. Schools that taught mostly Spanish and a little Basque, or mostly Basque and a little Spanish. And in the beginning, the parents chose mostly Spanish. Now they choose mostly Basque. Why? Because they have seen the evidence that the children who learn in mostly Basque do better. Even the university entrance exam for Spain, the Basque children who are multilingual do much better than monolingual Spanish children. Okay, so the power of the multilingual brain is very clear there. And so again, we are actually hurting children when we force them into a language they don't understand. It won't help them. And then the second thing I observed in the English classes in Basque country, looking with small children, 5 or 6 years old, they all spelled by their own way. It was not typical English spelling. Now, if a teacher in Asia saw that, they'd say, oh, this is terrible! The children must spell correctly from age 5, or they will never spell correctly. No, in Basque country, they encourage the children, enjoy English, be confident, spell it any way you want. The children could still read it. I could not read it, but the children could read it, and they were very proud of it. So I think their teaching techniques and the evidence that parents have seen over 20 years just make the Basque country example so powerful and an inspiration for many people.
Thanks for that. Can I just say something about Sozinho's country? In Mozambique, what they did after a multilingual education experiment, in which I was partially involved in the 1990s, they actually were able to bring mother tongue-based programming into the curriculum reform of 2002 as an option. And I think that was one of the smartest things they did, because parents, not all parents, are going to choose the same kind of education for their children, even in public education. But what that did was it allowed the parents who had already seen children learning well through their mother tongues, it allowed them to ask for multilingual education, and little by little, the excitement about that form of education has grown. It's been consistently under-resourced by the Ministry of Education. A lot of foreign projects didn't pay much attention to even that option in the curriculum reform. So I'm criticizing some of us foreigners for not doing our homework about what language policy and education really was, or for listening only to a few people in the higher levels of the Ministry of Education who speak a language that the foreigners speak, because they might not be completely aware of what's happening in education in their own country. But that was one of the best things that Mozambique did, I think, was to offer multilingual education based on mother tongue as an option. And it has been catching on. There have been NGOs supporting that, and little by little, it's growing. So maybe that's a lesson in patience also, and in just demonstrating what is possible so that parents can make a better choice or a more educated choice about what they want for their children.
Well, Carol, thank you very much for very sophisticated way of telling a very simple story. My question is that you didn't say much about teacher training, because as the Federation of Teachers, whatever they call themselves, based in Belgium, they say there's no better system than its own teachers. There's no better system than its own teachers. So you can have some of the most beautiful things. If the teacher training itself is not in place, you won't get anywhere where we've never been before. The example you are citing from my country, in 1983, when we started discussing, it was a bit of a taboo because of the revolution, but we could work within the system and say, look here, there are more other languages around than Portuguese. So we suggested that bilingual education should be optional. But what we did not do, which is very, very, very serious, there was no teacher training in place to support the system. You know that all that we did in Mozambique in terms of teacher training, it was under the assumption that teachers were going to teach in Portuguese, and we expect them to operate in bilingual schools. So I wanted you to say something about, teacher training, how what you are suggesting would work in terms of teacher training college, because the teachers are the ones who are going to implement these things. We are not us, the researchers. The Basque experience you are mentioning, I know it very well. I was there, and I once told the governor of the Basque country when they were thinking that Spanish was the best way to go. I said, you see, in a very militant setup like the Basque country, you don't want to appear on TV speaking in Spanish because people won't take you seriously. He said, no, because you don't know these things. So it's a very limited experience to a very, very controllable situation. But how do we, in terms of teacher training, in a much more larger setting like the ones you mentioned in my beloved country? I would like to hear you saying about something about teacher training. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just come here because I'm going to hold on to the microphone. That's a wonderful question by a very knowledgeable person about the context. One thing that I can say about Mozambique is, yes, these things happen in policy, and then everyone scrambles around trying to make it happen somehow. So there were a few things that happened after that policy came into place. There was actually more demand than the Ministry of Education people could address, more demand for multilingual education at the local school district level. So colleagues worked at a lot of different levels. One thing that happened was, after some struggles, there was a single course in bilingual education that is now offered, as far as I know, it's offered in all of the teacher training institutions. One course called Bilingual Education that actually covers some of the theoretical aspects, like from Jim Commons, and talks about the possibility in the curriculum and so on. So there's one course that was the result of struggles to bring bilingual education into the teacher training system. Obviously, that's not enough, but it's something anyway. Another thing that happened is that linguists from the Universidad de Eduardo Mondlane, the National University, they're quite aware not only of the linguistic issues of making sure that all these languages are ready to be used in terms of reading and writing in materials, but they've done a lot of work, applied work. So I really congratulate them because many of them were trained as theoretical linguists and they're doing applied work with teacher training at the in-service level, going to the different provinces and dealing with specific languages, making sure that teachers know how to read and write their own languages so they can use them in school. I want to mention, because this reminds me of a situation in Ethiopia that I'm very concerned about, and maybe Solomon or others can talk about this, address this, but one of the things that we found, I was part of a team that looked at the state of multilingual education in Ethiopia, but it was some time ago, it was 2006, 2007. But what we found was when we were looking at that 8-year policy of using mother tongue for 8 years of primary school and the different regions and how they were applying this to, in reality, one of the things that we found that we thought was wonderful is that most regions were training their teachers within the region, and most of the teacher training colleges, they were colleges at that time, they were local, some of them were private, some were public, but they were using the regional languages to train the teachers. What happened? I'll make this very simple. Probably it's a more complex process, but it looked to me like this. World Bank had been saying teacher professionalization means university education for all primary teachers. What happens? There aren't universities in all the regions. We have to go somewhere else. What ends up being the medium of instruction at universities? Languages that teachers don't necessarily speak, should not be using in a multilingual education setting, and yet there it is. Right? So teacher professionalization took all of those most Ethiopian teachers and put them into English language universities, which does not prepare them for using their own languages in written and read form. And there was this kind of backwash also from testing only in English and from the ministry, the central ministry, sending out the curriculum to the regions only in English. So it was up to the regions to translate that curriculum or to make it work in the multilingual education system. So those are all really important issues, and they're good to be aware of if you're involved in any of the implementation.
There's a queue. Giri first, and the gentleman at the back, and then Dubai. And we've got 5 minutes left. So can you make the question short?
And I'll make the answer short.
Yeah, my question relates to the Indian context. Is there any definitive research evidence about mother tongue as a medium of instruction in India at the primary level vis-a-vis English? Thank you.
India's been an inspiration for a lot of the world in terms of multilingual education or L1-based education, what is possible. But I think we're also moving toward looking at, because it's very rare to find the use of a mother tongue, other than in Western countries, use of a mother tongue for a longer period of time. Most of the time it's just a couple of years. So when you're trying to assess achievement based on just a couple of years of using a local language, you're not going to get wonderful results. And so I think one of the reasons we found Ethiopia very exciting is that there are some really good results it's a great example of, in some of the regions, using a regional language for 8 years of primary school and testing at the 4th grade and 8th grade level in that language. So is that enough of an answer? We do have some good results, but they can't ever be very conclusive, because if the home language is only used for a couple of years, there's nothing in even the theories that says that that's a good thing to do. Thanks.
Last question.
Thank you. I think along with teachers' training and competency, while monitoring and evaluation is also important. As for the Basque evidence, I think in Pakistani context, in the Sindh province in the southern Pakistan, Sindhi is taught at the primary level, but when they measure the indicator, the learning outcome, so the children didn't work well. So the dominant language educates argue against the multilingualism educates because of that factor, as the kids at those schools were not performing well. So I think this is very crucial that the teachers' training, competency, and monitoring evaluation all should be considered equally. Just a comment.
Thanks. Just briefly, I don't know, this just reminded me of something that you may know about, but a couple of World Bank people, because I said something bad about World Bank before, I'll say something nice. Some of the World Bank people actually looked at the cost-benefit of using mother tongue, and they used examples from Guatemala and Senegal. And using their economic models, they looked at initial investment, which it requires a lot to start a L1-based program, right? And it's mostly materials and teacher training. So they looked at the cost of starting that up, and then they looked at the benefits in terms of less repetition, less dropout, more success, children who actually learn something, and they actually only looked at the benefits in terms of per pupil expenditure, avoiding dropout and repetition. And what they found is that those initial costs were compensated for. That is, the system kind of broke even after only a couple of years. And so if you look at a system that has a lot of wastage in terms of dropout repetition, and you bring in this kind of investment, it will actually pay for itself. That's what their studies showed. So maybe I'll leave you with that, because it's sort of an optimistic way of thinking about how multilingual education could work, given appropriate conditions, including teacher ed.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Carol. Fascinating presentation and lots of good discussion. Can you join me in thanking Carol for that?
And I'm not something serious. Thank you very much.
Time for lunch. Isn't it? Isn't it?
I think it's lunch. Don't make us worry.
Hope you write it up.